what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do this kind of at a local scale to help to those of you who are not familiar with what renewable means to rural locations, but then I'm going to use that sort of as a launching board to talk about renewables more generally and so on. So I'm going to start. So it's Hampshire County, and I'll show you a little map of where Hampshire County is. It's west of rural county in West Virginia, right over the border from Virginia. I'm retired from pay and work, retired in 2021. And let's roll on. This is our roof at our place in West Virginia, just so that you know I'm not a total renewable hater by any means. What I'm going to be talking about is industrial scale renewables, both wind and solar, not the kind of stuff you put on your roof. And we have these on our roof because we're so far off the grid, or so far off the grid, essentially, we'd have had to have a mile's worth of power lines to get back there. So the choice was that or solar energy. So solar. So the other thing is I've got a lot of practical experience with the wonders of and the not so wonders of solar energy. So the local energy, and so here's a map. I need to, let's see, there we go. I need to move this over of basically the border area between Virginia and West Virginia. Here is, let's see, I got to figure out how to make this smaller. There we go. All right, this is Hampshire County, Washington, D.C., obviously, and I'll speak to this in just a second. In this area here, Loudoun County and its surrounds is the largest concentration, apparently in the world of data centers and hyperscalers. There's supposedly around 300 to 400 of these facilities, and they are big power sucks. Some of them anywhere from 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts, use a lot of energy. So our county, Hampshire County, and many rural counties around America, to be sure, are facing potential avalanche of industrial scale solar and wind facilities. Some have already had that avalanche and are undergoing it. Why is this in our case? We've got a lot of undeveloped forests and farms. We're extremely vulnerable, like a lot of rural counties. There are no relevant land use controls. There are these heavy power users, as I mentioned, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Amazon, the big five in Northern Virginia. And they are hungry to pay renewable developers for renewable energy credits, or RECs, RECs. And then there are these massive federal subsidies, which I'm not sure what everybody's familiar with or not, but they're very, whoops, okay, there we go. They're very substantial. The low ball estimate is there's about $369 billion for zero carbon electricity. It's primarily aimed, of course, at solar and wind. But there are estimates, depending on what happens in the out years, of up to $1.2 trillion. So here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about our watershed and two examples of grid scale solar. I'm going to talk about some myths and facts about renewable energy, some of the issues for our county and rural America, and then some big picture issues. And, obviously there's a whole lot of facts available all over the place on renewables and any other energy source for that matter. But I'm going to use what I think are credible facts and figures and graphics, but I encourage you to think for yourself. And then I've got a trigger warning. Some of this may cause indigestion for some of you, I'm not sure. So the first thing I wanted to talk about our watershed, and this is key. I'm an environmentalist. That's my training, and that's what has motivated me throughout my career, and that's why I got into nuclear in the first place, and fusion energy and fusion energy development and so on. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's all about the environment. So I want to talk about forests. Our watershed is about 80% forested. And really in the mid-Atlantic, when you go out and put a solar farm somewhere, you're going to end up in some forest somewhere, or you're going to end, and this happens to be with windmills too, or somebody's field, meadow, farm, so on. That's where they put these things. They don't put them in downtown New York City. So I want to talk about forests for a second. They provide massive amounts of ecosystem and economic services. I know I'm telling you a lot of stuff you probably already know, but they filter and store and release clean water to our streams and rivers. They recharge groundwater. They help prevent flooding. They provide forest products, recreation, quiet enjoyment. They maintain a huge amount of our nation's biodiversity and refuge for many increasingly rare species. They beautify the landscape. They I don't have it here, but they are a key part of climate resiliency. They clean the air, they create soil. And to the point of much of this discussion about renewables, they store and sequester a lot of carbon. And then much of the rest of our county is farms and farmland. And farms and farmland have a lot of economic and ecosystem services too. Big part of the economy. They absorb and recharge groundwater, or absorb rainwater and recharge groundwater. A healthy lifestyle that's increasingly threatened in the U.S. Obviously, food and farm products in our county and a lot of places, it's a big tourism attraction. Scenic value, they can build well-run farms, build soils quite nicely, provide habitat for a lot of critters, and they also sequester a lot of carbon in their soils. So first example I want to show you here is of a this was primarily farmland, meadow for hay taking, I believe most of it, but keep your eye on these patches right here, here, and here, and then I'm going to go on to the next slide. So this is 60 acres of solar panels, and this is a drone video that was taken just about 3 days ago. So this solar farm is almost finished, and it's 60 acres all in, maybe going to 200 acres eventually of panels. And that 60 acres, generally, it's around 10 acres per megawatt, 7 to 10 acres per megawatt. But in our areas of the world, it's about 10 acres to the megawatt. So really, you've got about 6 megawatts represented here, which is kind of a piddling amount of power. And that's less than 20% of the time, because the capacity factor of these things in our part of the country is generally less than 20%. So this is a done deal, and this slipped past the County Planning Commission and the County Commission, because we have no land use controls. But now we're in a bit of a battle, more than a bit of a battle, about this property and others that are kind of come along. This is a very different scale. And here's Cape and Bridge, which is a little town which is right inside the West Virginia, not far, about 6 miles from the Virginia border. But this property is 633 acres, and it's over 2/3 forested. It's a beautiful forest. And this guy, Ben Haynes, has leased his property to a Israeli company by the name of Intergex to put a 500-acre industrial solar farm there. Just worth noting, the stream that goes through here is a native trout stream. Here's Cape and Bridge's water supply. Water flows this way, or the stream flows that way. So it's quite controversial with Cape and Bridge, and there's just some wonderful people in Cape and Bridge that are trying to figure out how to fight this thing. It's very complex. So here it is from the road, Ben Haynes' property. The forest is beautiful. It's just a beautiful piece of land, and the forest rolls on back over these hills. And so what happens during an industrial solar farm construction? First of all, you got to get rid of all of the trees and vegetation. This is done with really heavy soil compacting equipment. Roads are bulldozed, created. Some leveling is going to be done. They might say, they being the developer might say, well, we're going to save that topsoil and they'll pile it up. But if you know anything about soil, once you scrape it, it's a living thing. Once you scrape it and pile it up, within a few years, it's dead. It's basically dust, and it's worthless in terms of putting it back on and saying, well, we finished the job of reclamation. As they say, that dog doesn't hunt. And then there are sediment ponds, bridges, culverts, pads for inverters. And then I'll show you some of these types of foundations that are done for the solar panels. And then their solar panels are installed, and then fence the area off. And then they're going to have maybe some kind of vegetation planted and presumably maintained, and undesirable vegetation, maybe herbicides, maybe mowing, maybe both. Sometimes you'll see this term agrivoltaics. As far as I can see, that doesn't happen very often, where you're running cows or goats or sheep and they're under the solar panels. So here's some examples of solar panel supports. Most of these are kind of old style, but these things have to be way into the ground. As you might imagine, solar panels are like a kite, and they got a big, potentially very large wind load on them. So these foundations, sometimes they're 10 or 11 feet into the ground. Now a common way is they have these big ground screws, and that's at that first solar farm I showed you. That's what they used. The soil was not particularly rocky, so they got away with that. But sometimes it's more profound foundations than that. These things can be very expensive to remove, and the contracts, I think, frequently uh, allow or may allow the developers, when and if they come to clean it up, to cut them off at what they call plow depth, and then move on without having to pull them out of the ground. So this was from a webinar, just real quickly, that was about 4 weeks ago. And this Michael Roland, he's the head of the Virginia DEQ, and they have been struggling to keep up. Virginia is ground zero, as is North Carolina and other states, for solar farms. A massive amount of solar farms in Virginia. But they have found that a lot of the developers just do not live up to the premises. There's a lack of proper vegetation, poor runoff control, erosion, and so on. A whole lot of runoff into the local streams and so on. Big problem in Virginia. This is one of the things we're quite worried about in West Virginia. And other things that happen, very low probability or low probability, high consequence events with solar farms. There can be fires, and they happen. Actually, about 3 or 4 weeks ago in Texas, some of you may have read about this. There was a big hailstorm that took out well over 1,000 acres of solar panels. And then there's also, this is Puerto Rico, but hurricanes sometimes take these things out too. So now I'm going to talk about two fundamental problems with solar and wind. So I'm going more general now a little, and these are as far as I can see, two fundamental problems. One, sun and the wind are not concentrated energy. If they were concentrated energy, we might as well be living on the surface of Venus or Mercury. When you went outside, you'd burn up or you'd blow over. So as a consequence, not being concentrated requires a whole lot of land to collect it. Reference back the 60 acres for 6 megawatts back there. And it requires a lot of equipment to turn it into useful energy. And what that really means is it's very expensive up front, and there's a whole lot of waste at the tail end to dispose of. And the other thing about sun and the wind, of course, is they're intermittent and unreliable. I don't mean to be pejorative, it's just the way it is. And what that means is requires 100% backup power or batteries. So this should look familiar to many of you. And Matt, I stole this graphic from you all from Generation
We'll send you the
Atomic.
bill later.
Yeah, and I modified it because I think you had it in square meters, and that was to where I've shown a similar presentation was not very useful. So I translated into acres and then multiples of what a nuclear power plant or a natural gas or coal plant would take. And I think you're low on the solar side, but basically a nuke can be square mile, which is about 620 acres or 400 acres or less, substantially less. And solar is about 116 times that amount of land, and wind, according to your all's calculations, about 450 times that. And I'll mention that not far from our county, over the border in Virginia, in Warren County, there is a combined cycle natural gas plant. It's 1.5 gigawatts. It's on 38 acres of land. So concentrated power. Another a broader land use example is in Virginia right now, about 50,000 acres are currently covered by solar panels, and about 58% of that has been taken out of forests, about 25% out of really, much of it's really good farmland. And that, according to the Solar Energy Industries Association website, only provides about 6.56% of Virginia's electricity. And the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality estimates that that by 2045, 150 to 300,000 acres of solar in Virginia. And I don't know if any of you know about or have read any or looked at the Princeton Net Zero report. It came out, I think it was in 2021 or 2022, voluminous report. They estimate if we went all renewable energy, not just talking about electric power, that by 2050, it would require 262 million acres to do it. Do the math real easily. It's about 17 states of West Virginia or 9 states of Ohio worth of land, or shocking amount of land. So again, on the not so concentrated side of things, or diffuse energy, it takes about 15 times the amount of materials to collect solar energy in some way that might equal a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant. Wind, about 10 times more materials. So there are consequences of this. I'm going to go back to the Ben Haynes property and just give you some sense of how much material, how much stuff is required. So the Ben Haynes property, 500 megawatts, or I'm sorry, 500 acres, that would translate into something like 50 megawatts. Actually, I think it's a little less than that, but if you do the math, that's 50 million watts, of course. You divide it by what that will probably use 350 watt panels. So that'll be about 143,000 solar panels, and each one of those things will be an inch and a half, about an inch and a half thick. And so if you take that 143,000 times and stack an inch and a half, inch and a half, inch and a half, you get a stack of stuff that's 3.4 miles high. Less high if it's 500 watts per panel. But that's not even accounting, of course, for the foundations of these things and the inverters and all the stuff that goes in and doing the wiring and so on that goes into doing one of these things. So a massive amount of stuff for just 50 megawatts. And again, that 50 megawatts, it's only available around 20% of the time. So who's going to clean this up? Well, it's our kids and grandkids. And some of these panels, in fact, the panels that Interjex uses, will use on that 500-acre solar farm if they get to do it, are these cadmium telluride panels. And they're fine if they maintain their integrity. But this is a controversial thing wherever they go, wherever Interjex goes, and wherever these first solar panels go. People are very worried about contamination from heavy metals. Anyway, are these things recycled? Well, reality is, according to NREL, about 90%, NREL being the National Renewable Energy Lab, about 90% of solar panels are just landfilled. And why? Well, it's extremely expensive to recycle a solar panel. They're complex structures, plastic, silicone or cadmium telluride material, metals, so on, more plastic, glass, aluminum, etc. It's a sandwich put together with adhesives that's really difficult. So the recycling process is both mechanical and solvent based. It's expensive, and at the end of it, there's a lot of goo left over. Or it's really cheap just to take them and dump them in the landfill. And so that's where they go. And as far as recycling, I think it's always going to be the case just because of the difficulty of recycling these things, that most are going to go to the landfill. So let me talk about wind for a minute, aside from the visual blight, the noise, and the bird and bat kills, a few things about wind. So every one of these guys has one of these guys in it. So they're like big trees. They need a big root ball. So these foundations are 50 to 60 feet wide, and they're about 10 feet deep, and they're solid concrete and rebar, and they weigh anywhere from 1 million to 2 million pounds. And that is going to be in the ground pretty much forever. So you go and you plow down the tops of these forests and tops of the mountains, and with roads and so on, and you put these things in there. The top of that mountain is never going to be the same. And what about windmill blades? Of course, they're epoxy fiberglass composites. They are very difficult to recycle. Some people claim, well, we turn them into playgrounds and bus shelters and so on. But the reality is most of them get landfilled, and they will be landfilled because they're just really hard. These composite materials are very hard to, next to impossible to recycle. And in the category of low probability, high consequence events, actually you can go do a Google search for windmill fires. You see a whole lot of pictures for them. They happen. And also sometimes they get out of balance, spin out of control, throw blades way off into the air. So people that are, we have a case just over the border in Hardy County from us where people are fighting a windmill farm tooth and nail, but they don't want these things next to them for lots of reasons. But this is one of them. The fire department can't even begin to touch this kind of stuff. So this is maybe one of the most important slides I've got. This is the big exaggeration that makes all this habitat destruction and waste seem worthwhile. These companies will say something like, well, our 50 megawatt solar farm is going to provide enough electric power to power us 50,000 homes or a city of 50,000 people. And you hear this a lot in the, in the mainstream media for sure. A more correct statement is, well, our 50 megawatt solar farm is going to provide enough electricity to power 50,000 homes, well, for a couple hours a day on the clearest summer day. And the rest of the time, not even close, especially at night. Yeah, just do this thought experiment. Let's cover the United States completely with an infinite amount of solar panels, and at night you're producing zero power. Uh, it's kind of amazing. Even more truthful statement, well, our solar farm is going to provide at best useful energy about 20 to 25% of the time. I'm being generous. And the rest of the time, every single watt of it's got to be backed up by another power source, a reliable power source such as natural gas. And it's usually natural gas, coal, or nuclear. And on intermittent and the intermittent and undependable disadvantage of solar and wind, does somebody have a question? Oh, okay.
I think that was just a random noise.
Okay. I had to turn off the screen so I could see my slides. Um, so again, solar, 20% to 30% capacity factor. That's way generous. Solar output, only for 12 hours a day. There's clouds, there's snow, weak sun in the winter. We experience this certainly in at our place in West Virginia. Wind has a somewhat higher capacity factor, but of course, zero output with no wind. They have mechanical issues, sometimes snow and ice on the blades. Out west, extreme cold can shut them down. And in fact, when really extreme cold, they use up energy just to keep the oils and so on in them going, machinery from freezing up. So what does this require? Who cares that it's intermittent and undependable? Well, again, it requires a double-built utility system. So the electric grid has to be 100% reliable. We don't do well as a society with no electric power. So wind and solar can quickly drop the beat. Zero, not the basis of a reliable grid. So again, it's all got to be backed up by a quickly dispatchable and reliable energy source, and that's usually natural gas. It load follows well. So powering fossil fuel plants, this is a parenthetical almost, up and down. That load following is extremely inefficient, it's expensive, and it has a large carbon footprint. So it's not the best way to run a natural gas plant. And affordable, long-lived, and widely deployed grid-scale battery systems, well, really unlikely. The most recent of these is this Nova Power Bank in California. It is 680 megawatts for only 4 hours. It might have a useful life of 10 years or so, and it's $1 billion. And by the way, after that discharge of 4 hours, then you got to recharge it. So you got to have the power, extra power to do that the next day. So whether it's backup power or batteries, renewables require huge amounts of additional infrastructure, which means huge added costs and big environmental impacts. So what's the plan to go 100% renewable? So right now, and Wendy and Gene, fact check me here, but right now in the United States, we have something like 12,000 power plants connected by, actually, this is a lowball estimate, by about 300,000 miles. I've seen as many as 500,000. I have not been out to measure it, but it's a lot of power lines. And so we have these, the PJM system here and others, and then there are grid interconnections. And of course, ERCOT is down here on its own, but a lot of power lines to connect and promote the reliability of our grid system. Well, the future, the green energy future is something like this, where you're going to have tens of thousands of more power plant locations, and then you got to connect all these things up with bigger grid interties, and as much as tripling the existing amount of power lines. And then the example I like to use is, so the theory goes that, well, we have a big East Coast snowstorm or something like that, and the windmills aren't turning and the solar panels aren't producing anything. And what do? Well, you got to wheel power in from somewhere west, and those people have to be so over their power supply has to be so overbuilt that it could handle contingencies like that. So it's this kind of amazingly overbuilt, uh, uh, interconnected with massive amounts of new power lines kind of system. So here it is. Here is the secret sauce that makes the green energy transition work. Tens or hundreds of thousands of miles of new transmission lines. This is green energy here. And just announced, I just saw this yesterday, just for whatever it's worth, the Department of Energy has a new sort of initiative. Maybe it's not so new. It's called the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors. And there are 10 of these. And these are high priority where DOE is going to both subsidize private companies and FERC presumably will make life easier to get these things done. Here's the one going through just our area, and you can see all these presumed new power lines going down to service that very area, Virginia, Loudoun County, and so on, that has all these data farms there. But a lot of this is as is admitted in the DOE documents. It has to do with connecting all the renewable energy that's going to be coming on the grid. So I just say right here, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with DOE's work that they've done and just the common sense thing. You've got all these coal plants, and there's also abandoned natural gas plants and so on that you could repower with nuclear, take care of low carbon, clean electric power, don't need new power lines because they're already on the grid and so on. But somehow this gets drowned out in the noise. So question, do renewables reduce carbon emissions? We'll run through some stuff here. 15 times more energy and materials to manufacture solar, 10 times more for wind. That's high carbon emissions. Grid scale wind and solar require destruction of forests and farms that sequester carbon. So the very act of doing that, high carbon emissions, less carbon sequestration in the future. Big transmission line build out. They're very carbon intensive. They cut up forests and farms. More carbon emissions, less carbon sequestration. Backup power systems, carbon intensive, and often require new fossil plants to be built. High carbon emissions. Likely decades to restore land, formerly forested land, to the before conditions. So that's less carbon sequestration through time. And if relatively short-lived solar panels or windmill blades are recycled, those processes are highly energy intensive and are going to result in substantial solid waste themselves, big carbon emissions. So I asked the question, even if there are some carbon savings from the grid scale renewables, is the loss of our farms and forests, is it worth it? So to go back hyper local for a minute, but it's also relevant to counties across America. Who wins in this? Well, the renewable energy developer does. They make big dollars from the federal subsidies. We can talk about that if you want. The big tech companies, they get to paint themselves green. The landowner that leases to the renewable developers, they get very lucrative lease payments, but of course they have higher taxes and they've ruined their land. Local government's going to get some incentives. They'll buff up the firehouse or help pay for a new school gymnasium, something like that. And they'll get some increased tax dollars. And then some local suppliers will benefit or may benefit. So these are private short-term gains, mostly private. But who loses? Well, the surrounding properties are going to suffer a loss of value for decades. The landowners that live around these things, they're going to be deprived of their peaceful enjoyment of the property for decades. Rural lifestyle, that's why people move out in the country. That's eroded for decades. Natural beauty, tourism eroded for decades. Natural habitat and agricultural economy suffers for decades. There's sort of a cascading effect we can talk about if you want on that. Higher federal taxes and higher power costs. I didn't talk about the power costs, but they will be higher. And so this is a multi-generational loss for everybody in the county or in rural America generally. So before we end, I want to go big picture for just a second. I don't know how many people have seen this. This is the best one. It's from Lawrence Livermore Lab, but it's taken from the Energy Information Administration statistics, good statistics, but it's the best graphic. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a study. But some things worth mentioning, electric power is, oh, and by the way, this is in quads, but it just so happens it's a beautiful thing. Sometimes things work out. It's basically 100 quads, so you can consider these numbers percentages. So electric power is around 37, 38% of the energy we consume. And as you can see, it's already because of nuclear and hydro and a little bit of geothermal and wind and solar. It's already the most decarbonized sector. It's when you knew, and G knows this well, when you move down to industrial and transportation, this is when you're really burning the carbon. These things are essentially 100% carbon. But I want to focus just for a second on transportation. It's about 28% of the energy we use. And it turns out that about 15% of that 28% is jet fuel. I think both military, but certainly civilian. And so you do that math and you end up with jet fuel is around 4% of the energy we use in the United States. And I have this app on my phone. It's called Plane Finder. You should get it. It's really cool. But it'll show you at any given moment what's in the sky, and you can hone in on it, individual planes and so on, or planes. It just shows civilian planes and those that are non-classified. But here is a typical day, moment in a typical day in the United States. This is all fossil fuel. It's right now, if I pulled up Plane Finder, it would look just like this. It's, again, 4%. It is unbelievable to me, at least, to think, oh, we're going to do all this with solar panels and windmills. The other thing that, before I close here, well, there's two other things, is just this is one projection. I don't want to focus on it too much, but it just illustrates that the future. And the future is not growth of carbon emissions in America. It's here. It's China, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, Central and South America. We don't have much leverage in going into the future at all on carbon emissions and so on. So to me, it seems incredible just to imagine, well, we're going to wreck massive amounts of our environment for probably relatively very small impact on carbon emissions. So this is the last slide. We're in the home stretch. Meanwhile, nuclear energy in the US is getting nowhere fast. I don't think it is a punching bag for most of the environmental community. The magical belief in grid scale renewable energy is a major block to moving nuclear forward. And in this country, of course, it's also licensing and financing and so on. So ask the question, and this is a group to do it. Should nuclear proponents take the gloves off? That is, tell the truth when talking about grid scale renewables. And if so, how, when, and where? So I leave you with those questions. That's it.
Art, thank you so much.